Welcome to the regular virtual meeting of the City Planning Commission Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, March 11th, 2021. This meeting includes the remote participation of board members and staff as authorized under Minnesota Statute Section 13D.021 due to the declared local public health emergency. My name is Alyssa Olson. I'm the Vice President of the Planning Commission. At this time, I will call the meeting to order, and I'll ask the clerk to call the roll to verify quorum.
Commissioner Baxley.
Present.
Caprini. Smiley.
Here.
Ford. Marwa. McGuire.
Present.
Meyer.
Here.
Olson.
Here.
Schrader. Sweezy. That's 5 members present.
Oh, all right. So we have a quorum. Let's see. Okay, so with that, we'll proceed to the agenda. A copy of the agenda was posted for public access to the city's legislative information management system, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. Commissioners, can I have a motion to adopt the agenda? Commissioner Smiley.
I move to adopt the agenda.
Is there a second? Commissioner Meyer.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Could the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Baxley.
Present.
Would you like to vote yay or nay on the motion of the agenda, approving the agenda?
Sure. Yay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Caprini. Smiley.
Aye.
Ford. Marwa. McGuire.
Aye.
Meyer.
Aye.
Aye.
Schrader. Sweezy. That's 5 yeas.
All right, that motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Next on the agenda is acceptance of the minutes of the regular meeting on February 25th, 2021. Commissioners, can I have a motion to accept those minutes? Commissioner Smiley.
I move to accept the minutes.
Commissioner McGuire.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Could the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Baxley.
Yay.
Caprini. Smiley.
Abstain.
Thank you. Ford. Marwa. McGuire.
Aye.
Meyer.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
Sweezy. That's 4 yeas.
All right, that motion passes. Next up is the consent agenda, and we have 5 items on the consent agenda. So we have lots of roll calls today. And the first item is number 4, land sale at 722 Newton Avenue North, and staff is Medel Duenas.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Medel Duenas, and I'm a planner in Long Range Planning. Again, I have 3 items on the consent agenda. The first item is number 4, which is the land sale of 722 Newton Avenue North. The parcel is guided as urban neighborhood and interior 2. Staff has received proposal for the rehab of a 1 to 3 dwelling unit home, which is allowed under the future land use and built form guidance of Minneapolis 2040. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission find that this land sale is consistent with the future land use and built form categories of the comprehensive plan. Are there any questions?
Commissioners, are there any questions or discussion, or would someone like to make a motion? A motion would be for consistency with the comprehensive plan. Commissioner McGuire.
I will make the motion. I think Commissioner Esmaili also put it in there. Commissioner Olson, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Medel, do we need to take action on every single one of these items individually? Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay. All right, so we have a motion for consistency with the comprehensive plan from Commissioner McGuire. Commissioner Esmaili, was it you who had a second?
Yes, second.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Commissioner Baxley,
Yay.
Caprini, Ford,
Yay. Hey.
glad you made it. Marwa, McGuire,
Aye.
Meyer,
Aye.
Schrader. Oh, sorry. I apologize. I'm out of order. Yes. So thank you. Yes, Olson. You're voting aye. Thank you.
Yes, thank
Schrader is not here, and I believe Sweezy is still not here. I'm just calling their names in case they snuck in and I didn't see them. A Smiley.
Aye.
That's 6 days. Thank you.
All right, that motion passes. The next item is number 5. It's a land sale at 2348 James Avenue North. Go ahead, Medel.
Okay. So again, item number 5, the land sale of 2348 James Avenue North. The parcel is guided as urban neighborhood and interior 2. Staff has received proposal for the rehab of a single family home, which is under the future land use and built form guidance of Minneapolis 2040. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission find that this land sale is consistent with future land use and built form categories of the comprehensive plan. Are there any questions?
Commissioners, any questions, or would someone like to make a motion? Commissioner Smiley.
I move that this sale is consistent with Minneapolis 2040.
Okay, do I have a second? Commissioner McGuire.
I will second the motion.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Clerk, please call the roll.
All right. Commissioner Baxley.
Yay.
Caprini. Ford.
Yay.
Marwa.
Yay.
Meyer.
Yay.
Meyer.
Aye.
And
Aye.
Prater, Sweezy, Smiley.
Aye.
That's 7 yeas.
All right,
Chair
that
Olson?
motion passed. Go
Since
ahead.
we had a ruling from staff that we can vote on them all at once, can I request that we do updates on items 6, 7, and 8, and then vote on them at once if there's no objection?
Sure. I mean, yeah, if there's no objection, I must have missed that message. All right, so if there's no objection, we'll have Medell go, and then we have 2 more after that, and then we'll do 1 more vote. Does that sound good?
Yep.
All right. So next item is item number 6, and you can go ahead, Medell.
Okay. So item number 6 is the land sale of 2756 Queen Avenue North. The parcel is guided as urban neighborhood and interior 2. Staff has received proposal for the rehab of a single family home, which is under the future land use and built form, which is allowed under the future land use and built form guidance of Minneapolis 2040. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission find that this land sale is consistent with future land use and built form categories of the comprehensive plan. Are there any questions?
Commissioners, are there any questions? Sorry, I'm catching up on the chat here. Okay, so we do need to take a vote for each item. All right. So, Commissioners, are there questions on this item, or would someone like to make a motion?
Chair Olson, I apologize. It took me a second to unmute myself. This is Ken Daler from the clerk's office. I apologize if I'm being a little confusing in the chat, but what the message I was trying to get across is that it is up to the body to determine whether you want to have separate votes on each item, or if you'd like to combine them into one vote at the end for each presentation. Either way is fine. So if you'd like to do what Commissioner Meyer suggested and just vote on all of them at once, that is perfectly fine.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll remember this for the future. Okay. So if there's no objection, we will continue with presentations and then do a vote after the next 2. All right. Thank you, Medell. So our next item is item number 7, Baldwin Square Redevelopment Plan, and staff is Amber Turnquist.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Amber Turnquist, a planner in Long Range Planning. Item number 7 is the Baldwin Square Redevelopment Plan and modification number 130 to the Common Development and Redevelopment Plan and Common Tax Increment Financing Plan. The site is located at 4140 to 4154 Fremont Avenue North in the Weber-Camden neighborhood in Ward 4. The proposal is to redevelop the 2 parcels for a 24,330 square foot neighborhood commercial center. The first phase, known as Baldwin Square, will consist of a sit-down restaurant, bookstore, cafe, art gallery, event center, and second-floor office space. Fremont Avenue North is designated as a goods and services corridor. The current zoning of the project is C1 neighborhood commercial, and it is guided as corridor mixed use and corridor 4. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission find that the Baldwin Square redevelopment plan is consistent with Minneapolis 2040 and recommends that the City Planning Commission send to the City Council the comments contained in the staff report and recommend approval of the Baldwin Square redevelopment plan and approval of modification number 130 to the Common Development and Redevelopment Plan and Common Tax Increment Financing Plan. Please let me know if there are any questions.
It's quite the title. Commissioners, are there any questions or discussion before we move on to the next presentation? Commissioner Smiley?
Hi, thank you, Commissioner Olson. I just have one question for staff, and I guess that kind of applies to next item too. So the way that this is done is that there is no need to incorporate these redevelopment plans into the comprehensive plan to become part of the comprehensive plan. Am I understanding it correctly? Because I feel like in the previous plan we may have may have been done. That some small area plans were incorporated later into the comp plan. Am I understanding it correctly that this does not need to be incorporated?
That is my understanding. I can follow up with you on that.
Okay,
And
thank you.
if I can jump in, Commissioner Olson, Commissioner Ismaili, the way you're characterizing that, Commissioner Ismaili, is correct. The distinction here between a redevelopment plan and a small area plan is, a small area plan is something that would actually provide more refinement or change the guidance of the comprehensive plan. And in that case, yes, would need to become part of the comprehensive plan or change the comprehensive plan. In this case, the redevelopment plan is simply a tool that is used for financing of the project, and doesn't actually change anything about the comprehensive plan.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, commissioners, if there are no other questions or discussion, we can move on to the next presentation, which is item number 8, and staff is Adrian Brockheim.
Yep. Hey, I have a little presentation that goes along with this. Hi, commissioners. I'm Adrienne Bach. I'm a principal planner in CPED. Today I'm presenting the Border Avenue Extension redevelopment plan and modification number 129 to the Common Development and Redevelopment Plan and Common Tax Increment Financing Plan. Border Avenue is located near the west edge of the North Loop neighborhood, adjacent to the Minneapolis Farmers Market, and a block from the Royalston Station, a light rail station on the Green Line extension that's currently under construction. Since the mid-1900s, this area has been used for commercial and industrial purposes. The planned location for the extension of Border Avenue is shown here in yellow, connecting Border Avenue south to Glenwood Avenue. The reason for extending the street is due to multiple barriers that keep this area isolated and the desire to reconnect the street grid to improve access to Royalston Station and underutilized parcels in the area for redevelopment. The city of Minneapolis will acquire the 5 parcels highlighted here in order to gain the right of way to build the extension of Border Avenue. Modification number 129 to the common plan will incorporate the Border Avenue Extension redevelopment project into the Minneapolis Common Development and Redevelopment Project, also known as the Common Project, and will also authorize the use of common project tax increment revenue to assist with the development and extension of Border Avenue. Comprehensive plan policies support the reasoning behind the extension of Border Avenue in this location. Multiple policies and action steps encourage the restoring of the street grid or breaking up large blocks into small walkable blocks, especially in transit station areas. Other policies encourage the use of city funds for implementing infrastructure that will support future development. In addition to the comprehensive plan, planning studies for this area have recommended this infrastructure investment. The North Loop Small Area Plan first conceived of this street as part of an important bike and pedestrian connection through the North Loop neighborhood and to the future light rail station. All subsequent planning documents, including those done in partnership with Hennepin County in preparation for the construction of the Green Line extension, have all included the Border Avenue extension in their recommendations. Staff finds that the plan is consistent with Minneapolis 2040 and requests that any comments on the plan be sent to my colleague Beth Grossen. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, commissioners, are there any questions or discussion or a motion? Commissioner Ford, go ahead.
Yes, quick question. What is going to be done with the remainder of the land that is being acquired there?
Beth, do you want to talk about those?
Yes, I'm happy to. This is Beth Grossen. I'm a senior project coordinator at CPED in business development. And the graphic that Adrian provided shows kind of what parcels are somewhat impacted, but really it's just the right of way and a small area for some parking that will actually be acquired. So it's essentially the area in yellow and a bit of the irregular parcel near Holden Street that will actually be acquired. The balance is available for private development with the existing owners.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Baxley?
Thank you, Commissioner. Just curious on the, I can imagine it's because of existing structure, but how did the road configuration come to be? Just curious.
The existing structure, I think, was done many decades ago when there was, I think, kind of a conversion from the original settlement of Minneapolis into more of an industrial area. And so there were large parcels and the feeling that the actual street grid was not necessary for trucking and larger operations. Clearly, it's an unfortunate situation, and it will take a lot of time to actually start turning it back into a more reasonable grid.
Yeah, it's just thank you. The configuration is interesting. I'm just wondering if it's setting up problems for the future as opposed to kind of running right into Glenwood. Obviously, there's a structure there. I didn't know if the city was acquiring all of those. They're not. It's just to kind of create the right of way. I see. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
All right. I'm not seeing any more questions. So Commissioner Meyer, go ahead.
I move to rule that items 6, 7, and 8 are consistent with the 2040 plan.
All right. Commissioner Smiley.
Second.
All right. So we have a motion and a second. Could the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Baxley.
Yay.
Freeney.
Aye.
Ford.
Aye.
Marwa.
Aye.
McGuire.
Aye.
Meyer.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
Schrader. Sweezy. Smiley.
Aye.
That's 8 yeas.
All right, those motions pass. Thank you to our presenters. Next is our discussion item for the night. It's just the one. It is parking, loading, and mobility zoning code text amendment, and staff is Joe Bernard and Jason Wittenberg.
Good afternoon, commissioners. We have a pretty lengthy discussion item today. There's, bear with me here while I get the slideshow up. The content here that we're going to take you through is about our parking, loading, and mobility zoning code text amendment. There are some pretty complex changes here that we're talking about, or involve changes to the zoning ordinance, comprehensive, I guess you could say. So want to make sure we take ample time here to bring you up to speed on what we've been working on, and make sure we can answer any questions and take feedback from you. Just to get this out there at the beginning, we are anticipating bringing this to the April 12th Planning Commission meeting for a public hearing. So we'll have about a couple more weeks here to make amendments to the work that we've done before we submit that staff report to this group. So with that, I'm going to get into the presentation here, and I think we're okay with interrupting with questions throughout the presentation, since there's so much material to get through here. I've got about 25 or 30 slides, but also totally fine to just hold comments till the end too, if you prefer. So as with all zoning ordinance changes that we bring to you, the intent of the work and the desired outcomes that we're looking for here are all identified in Minneapolis 2040 and other city policy documents like the Transportation Action Plan or the Climate Action Plan. We're hoping that these changes that we're proposing to parking and loading and TDM regulations, that they'll have a pretty strong impact on achieving these goals. In particular, I think there's a lot of connection here to climate change resilience and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. The specific direction that's called out in Minneapolis 2040, and there's more than just a couple of policies here, but I highlight a couple for you, is that the plan calls for the need to eliminate our requirement for off-street parking throughout the city, and to reevaluate maximums that we have in our parking ordinance. In addition to that, Minneapolis 2040 calls for creation and implementation of TDM strategies for new development. The Transportation Action Plan more specifically identifies updates to the zoning code that TDM strategies should apply to more projects than they do today. And I just want to pause for a second to acknowledge that we came with some very general information to this group back in August of last year. So some of this might be repeat information for you, but we want to make sure to get new commissioners up to speed on some of these things. So this slide, we're not going to go over it in great detail, but the point here, the message that we're trying to share is that parking reform at the city has been an ongoing thing for over 20 years. We've had incremental change to our regulations that have resulted in a current state where there's a fair number of parts of the city where minimum parking requirements have already been dropped to zero. And we see this project as kind of the next logical incremental step in improving regulation to support development outcomes that achieve our goals. Where this policy in Minneapolis 2040 comes from is shown on this slide. There are a lot of supporting research items that would direct a city to do this kind of work, and why other cities around the country have done this already. First thing you see here is that the cost of producing parking is paid for by residential owners and renters, and that's whether they use it or not. So this is shown to result in inflated housing costs, particularly for lower income households. Providing an overabundance of parking incentivizes automobile use at the expense of more efficient and environmentally friendly forms of transportation, ultimately resulting in greater demands being placed on our roadways and an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So this is sort of, if you build it, they will come concept of parking induced demand. There's also the issue of using our land more efficiently. Dedicate large portions of our land to this inactive use throughout the city, and it reduces the efficiency with which people can operate in the built environment. Sometimes the real estate market is strong enough to take care of this problem on its own, but in other cases, we feel it's important to protect future development opportunity in advance with our regulations. So an example of the way we've done that in the past and how we're doing that with our new built form regulations is with floor area ratio minimums, for example. And we'll talk more about what we might do with parking here in the next few slides to achieve a similar outcome. Of course, supporting walkable urban design is really important. And the more parking you have, the more curb cuts and drive aisles that you need to access that parking. And so that gradually degrades the built environment, the walkable urban design that we want to achieve to support alternative modes of transportation. Maybe not the most important thing here, but it's something we want to acknowledge is that parking reform has the added benefit of reducing the number of staff hours spent administering those specific parking regulations. And we hope that that time that is freed up, that staff spends that working on things that are more directly related to implementing the goals of Minneapolis 2040. And last but not least, regulatory relief. Eliminating parking requirements allows businesses to more easily locate in older parts of the city that maybe just don't have parking. As I said, we're not the first city to pursue elimination of parking minimums. There's a growing list of cities around the country that have already done this. This also isn't something that is just something that the planning discipline is calling for. There's broad consensus from sustainability and transportation professionals as well that this is something that we should do. And even recently, there was a call from the president of the Institute of Transportation Engineers that this is effective policy for achieving a number of goals in municipal planning documents. Okay, so let's dive into the actual changes that staff is proposing and that you'll see on April 12th, or some version of them, I should say. First is the easiest one to understand. Minimum parking requirements are proposed for elimination across the board. Each of these slides that we're going to go through here have a list of intended outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. I'm not going to go through each of those in detail in the presentation, but it's there as a resource if you care to take a closer look. As part of this work, we're also evaluating and proposing changes to the maximum parking requirements that we have. This one's a little bit more complicated. Currently, we have a general standard that we limit parking for non-residential uses to 1 space per 200 square feet of gross floor area. This comes with a huge caveat. There are individual standards for many uses in the zoning code that differ from this. But just using this as an example, there on the next slide, I'll have a little previously approved project that we can look at and see how these changes might affect development. We also currently have unique maximums in place for downtown, and that currently includes a maximum of 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit and 1 space per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area, so much more strict. Moving forward, we're proposing to create a tiered system for our parking maximums that take into account the existing and planned development intensity and transit service of a given location. So this means we'd like to tie those unique requirements to our built form districts that we have in the comp plan and that are in the zoning code now. And again, we'll go over an example on the next slide. This is, I understand this is complicated, but we have Core 50 and Transit 30 are our most intense built form districts. Those would play the same or similar role that downtown does today in our zoning ordinance in respect to parking. The Transit 10, 15, and 20 districts are kind of that middle tier. And they're typically applied in transit-rich areas, both in downtown and around our transit stations throughout the city. And then the third tier with the least restrictive maximums would be everywhere else. So we're generally looking to lower the maximums for most non-residential uses from that 1 per 200 square feet of GFA to no more than 1 per 300. We're also suggesting that we apply the existing downtown residential maximum that I mentioned, which is 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit, to all of the transit districts. So Transit 10 through Transit 30 and Core 50. So that will be something newly applied to areas outside of downtown. And then we're also proposing a maximum of 2 spaces per dwelling unit everywhere else in the city. We would exempt the smallest scale development from that requirement, the 1 to 3 unit projects. So what does that look like for a typical office development? The example here is a clinic and office project approved at 1200 Lagoon that proposed and supplied 69 parking spaces for what was approximately 29,000 square feet of space. Under our current regulations, this development would have been allowed to supply up to 145 spaces in most parts of the city. If it were downtown, that maximum would have been 29. On the right-hand side of this table, you see how our new proposal for maximums would apply to projects like this. So in most parts of the city, they could supply up to 97 spaces. In our Transit 10, 15, and 20 districts, they could have supplied up to 49, and then in the equivalent of downtown, 29 spaces. For surface parking, we currently don't have a hard limit on size. The downtown parking overlay does limit accessory parking, but we think it's important to pair our maximum regulations, parking regulations that we calculate based on the size of a building, with a hard cap for surface parking to control for those situations that are unique. So you see the proposal here would be 100 spaces. That would be the most that you could do in a surface parking lot without requesting a variance. We're also proposing to require electric vehicle charging for any new parking built moving forward. This is still a work in progress, but we want to make sure that this is something that you're thinking about as you review our ordinance language. Right now, we're considering, I think this is included in the memo, that we would require residential development 10 units or more to supply 10% of any of the parking spaces that they provide with electric vehicle charging stations. There would also be additional requirements to supply EV ready spaces, so where the electrical conduit is all run, and then we'd also require that the buildings be have enough electrical service to simultaneously charge a certain number of spaces at a given time. We're looking at what other uses we would require this in, and so you'll see in the proposal we're going to suggest requiring this for office and hotel uses as well. And the reason for those three, calling out those specific 3 uses, is that it's where in those cases cars sit in their parking spaces for a longer period of time, have more of an ability to take on more of a charge. For retail parking, we're going to have a lower requirement of 5% is what we're proposing, and that we want to make sure that the chargers that are installed in those instances can charge fast enough for it to make that worthwhile, since the turnover in parking is faster with retail. We're still thinking about, and there's some concern from housing staff, and we're working with them on this, and I think we'd be interested in the commission's feedback on this when we have discussion, is that there's some concern about how this impacts affordable housing projects. Even though we want to ensure that equitable access to this infrastructure occurs in the long run, we want to make sure that we're not inhibiting our affordable projects from being feasible. So something we're still working through there. Package of changes to the ordinance also includes amendments to our bike parking requirements and our bike parking facilities. Most of this is coming in the form of increases in our requirements. Some of them are fairly modest, but there are some pretty significant changes here too. So currently the residential requirement throughout the city is 1 bike parking space per 2 dwelling units in residential. And we're proposing to increase that to 1 space per 1 dwelling unit. There's one unique situation here is that the University District overlay, so 4 neighborhoods near the University of Minnesota, there already is today a higher requirement of 1 bike parking space per bedroom. That regulation, we're proposing to keep that in place. More commercial uses will be required to supply a minimum of 3 parking spaces. Right now, there's a fair number that are required to today, but we're expanding that requirement. And then the more significant change is the increase in requirements for larger projects. So shower and locker facilities are currently required for commercial buildings downtown, or I should say non-residential buildings downtown that have 500,000 square feet or more. We have only had in the last 20 years a handful of projects that would trigger that requirement. And we want to make sure that more projects are providing these types of facilities moving forward. So we're going to lower that threshold to 200,000 square feet and have that apply citywide. Well, let's look at what that change looks like. In the public service building, using that as an example. So the public service building is 378,000 square feet. It would trigger that requirement with this new ordinance. It did not as it went through the approval process previously. So the current standard in our ordinance would have required this building to provide 25 long-term bike parking spaces. Our proposed standard would require a minimum of 189. And what was actually built here was much more. So we're feeling pretty comfortable with these numbers in the sense that larger developments downtown have been supplying a good amount of bike parking. I see there's maybe a question. I'm happy to pause here if we want to do that.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Commissioner Olson. I just had a quick question about this. Is there any thought about visitor or short-term bike parking spaces that would be required as well? I bike as my primary form of transportation, and oftentimes in downtown, there's no safe parking for bikes. And I feel like there's a lot of people who come in and out of the area. What's the kind of the thought about that? And then my second question was about your slide before about that the commercial, is it the commercial tenant that would be required to kind of as a TI add bike parking if they were going into a space, or would it be the building owner's responsibility to have bike parking there?
Sure, Commissioner Marwa. On the first question, our current ordinance has these, I don't want to call them tiers. There's 3 separate standards for bike parking depending on the type of use that the bike parking is serving. So in the case that we might require bike parking for a commercial use, we require that at least 50% of those be short-term, I believe is the number. Where it's residential, we require that 90% of the spaces be long-term. So I can't remember exactly off the top of my head what we have in our proposal for downtown non-resident or for non-residential uses with larger projects like this. I can go back and take a look and get back to you. But yes, I agree with you that we want to make sure that we're requiring bike parking spaces for not just the users of or tenants of the building, but for visitors as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just with the number of bike thefts, having safe parking in some kind of section of it that's accessible would probably be a great help. Yeah, and then my second question, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So the second question regarding whose responsibility would this be. The zoning code is not does not take a stance on whether or not that's the building owner's responsibility or the tenant. They have to work that out between the two of them. I think it's pretty typical for the building owner to pass that requirement on, or that expense on to the tenant when they come in to pull permits to finish out their space. But as far as the zoning code is concerned, we just want to see it built. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on to loading ordinance changes. At this time, the changes that we're proposing to the loading ordinance are pretty minimal. We're exploring reducing or eliminating loading requirements for uses that are lower in intensity, and for uses like we've been using the example of a grocery store, where we want to increase the flexibility in how goods are received, with the intent here that we make it easier for grocery stores to locate in places in the city where maybe it's difficult to do so and where we need that type of use. We're also introducing some flexibility in our loading ordinance here that we would like to allow for the possibility to negotiate how much loading you're providing through our travel demand management ordinance, which is something that we'll talk about in greater detail here in a minute. So that's the extent of what we're proposing here. For this is kind of a unique one, the university area overlay, which I mentioned earlier in regards to bike parking. It was created over 10 years ago. And one of the main driving forces behind its creation was to address unique parking challenges that come with uses located near the university. And in particular, some of those parking regulations aimed at controlling the size and scale of smaller residential development. We've had the experience that 1 to 4 unit projects near the university sometimes operate more like dorms, where they have many more bedrooms than you would see in a typical residential project in other parts of the city. So since those parking regulations are going away, the parking used to be calculated per bedroom here, so 1 space per 2 bedrooms, and that helped limit the size of some of these projects, some of these smaller scale projects. We're proposing to introduce a limit on the number of bedrooms that you can have in 1 to 3 unit buildings in the interior built form districts within the university area overlay. This one is one of the very unique instances where parking regulations were probably used in a way that we prefer not to use them. But since they're going away, we still want to address this situation, and that's why you're seeing this proposal. Maybe one of the most significant changes that we're considering here in our amendment is to update our travel demand management process. Now I'm going to generalize here a bit as I go through this information, but want to give a sense of what the approach moving forward can be. We've historically used these regulations as a means to mitigate the negative effects of a development, and in some ways we'll continue to do that. But we want to shift focus a bit toward concepts and towards a goal where we shape development on the front end so that the negative transportation impacts of a development never really materialize. Of course, this is going to happen on a continuum, but we just want to highlight the frame of reference that we're pursuing here. So what we're trying to do is explicitly state the goal of achieving mode split and greenhouse gas emission goals in the ordinance instead of focusing on traffic, which is the status of travel demand management plans at the city. We'd like to de-emphasize traffic studies and instead have strategies that are just standard practice that developments provide to comply with our ordinance. We want to focus those TDM requirements on physical improvements or characteristics of a development to achieve our goals. This is something that's grounded in research that shows what is most effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example. But it also happens to be the thing that things that are easier for us as a city to enforce on an ongoing basis. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to do programmatic things, and we'll talk about them specifically in a minute, but the physical improvements are what we're trying to focus on. We want to apply the TDM regulations to more development than we currently do. So the current regulations apply to projects of 100,000 square feet or more of commercial development. And in working with Public Works, there are a lot of residential projects that get pulled into the TDM process just at staff's discretion today. So we want to just clarify when that happens. We are proposing to have a point system moving forward that would allow most development to comply with our TDM requirements just by doing a series of predetermined strategies. And we'll go over those in a couple slides here. And last, we still would like to retain that discretionary TDM process that I mentioned, particularly for uses that we know are going to have challenging transportation impacts, or maybe they're occurring next to an LRT station, and we really want to take the opportunity to take a closer look at how we can achieve the city's goals by taking a closer look at the transportation happening around a project. Okay, so getting into the weeds a little bit more, we're proposing another tiered system here for looking at TDMs, and we're referring to that as major versus minor. The distinction will be determined by the size of your project, either in dwelling units or non-residential square footage. Depending upon the size and use of your project, you'll be required to achieve a minimum number of points by employing those predetermined strategies that I mentioned. And each of those strategies will have points assigned, like a point value assigned to them. In addition to requiring more points, the projects that trigger that major TDM standard will still have to do a traffic study. I know this is a lot of information, so we're going to go over some examples here that hopefully will help. First, we'll just run through the thresholds really quick. Any building containing more than 50 units and less than 250 units will be in that minor category and will need to supply 4 points. Non-residential development that falls into that minor category is between 25,000 and 200,000 square feet of gross floor area. Keeping in mind, today, we only capture projects that are 100,000 or more. So we're capturing more projects, but we're intending to make the process a little clearer and simpler moving forward. Projects that are residential projects that have more than 250 units would fall into the major category and trigger a higher point requirement, 8 points in that case. And then non-residential development would that's over 200,000 square feet would also trigger that major review and need 10 points. There are a couple other uses identified here that we know are challenging from a transportation perspective that we're calling out in the ordinance. Meeting and reception halls are one of them, shopping centers are another, and then principal parking facilities is the other use we're going to capture. The last thing on this list here is just the acknowledgement that the planning director and city engineer could call for a traffic study for any project in the city, just as we do today. The actual strategies that we've got here are largely based on the research that suggests what's most effective and are easiest to enforce. And they're similar to strategies that we see that are required in many of our existing TDMs that we administer today. Administration and enforcement challenges are something that staff has voiced frustration with in the past, and it's something we're hoping to improve on here with this new system. I already mentioned that part of what we're emphasizing here with physical improvements is reducing the need for ongoing enforcement, but there's a couple of really important programmatic things here that I'll point out. Is the transit subsidy is something that we think is really important, and there's a couple other things here that aren't as tied to the built environment directly. But the point here of looking over this slide, we can talk about these specific strategies in greater detail after we get through the slideshow. Happy to do that. But I think what point we want to get across here is that the point system is structured such that if you are required to do a TDM minor review, you'll need to do either one of the top two items. You could do one of those top two items and just be done. Provide zero parking or provide a transit fare subsidy. Otherwise, if you're not going to do one of those things, you're going to have to do a combination of other items on the list. Okay, let's get through some examples, and then we can take questions and have a discussion. First, a couple of projects that would not trigger the TDM process moving forward. The one on the left is a residential project in the Westlake area. It's 49 units, was approved and didn't go through a TDM process that I'm aware of, and we wouldn't require that moving forward. On the right, you see a commercial project at 43rd and Upton that was approved at 17,000 square feet of commercial space. They supplied 6 parking spaces that would not have gone through our TDM process today and would not in the future either. The first residential example we have here that would trigger the TDM process, or would have, is at 1724 Nicollet. This project had 123 dwelling units and 2,900 square feet of commercial space. They supplied 62 parking spaces and 82 bike parking spaces. This would have been a TDM minor project, meaning they needed 4 points. And based on looking through the approvals for the project, they would have met the points for limited parking, but not entirely clear that they would have met points for anything else on the list. Perhaps the pedestrian realm of improvements would have been enough as well. I think as we go through these examples, part of this is to demonstrate that we are, while we're making the process easier in some ways, we are requiring more of some of our projects moving forward. And acknowledging that in getting rid of our parking requirements, we still want to have regulations that get us toward our goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and getting people out of their cars. So the next example, we've already looked at the 1200 Lagoon. This project supplied 69 parking spaces. It would have triggered the TDM minor standard and needed to get to 6 points. It's not clear from the project description how they would have met that. Perhaps they have a transit fare subsidy for their employees. But point being here, they would have had to find a way to supply one of these standards here, or a couple of these standards, I should say. Here's an example of a project that would have triggered the major requirement for residential at 319 dwelling units. That's well above that 250 dwelling unit standard. So they would have needed 8 points from the table. And again, and being that they supplied 254 parking spaces, 183 bike parking spaces, it's not clear from the table how they would have met that requirement. They would have had to supply more standards than they did. And finally, going back to the public service building, project would have triggered the major requirements for non-residential development and would have needed 10 points, and there's probably enough in this development that would have met those requirements. So we have some questions that we hope that the commission can spend some time on today, but of course we're here to help explain any parts of the proposal that are not clear at this point in time. We anticipate, I think I already mentioned the timeline of bringing this to you on April 12th. We anticipate publishing a draft of the ordinance hopefully tomorrow, so that you can look at it in much greater detail than what's included in the memo that you received. With that, I'll just turn it back to the chair, and we're here to support your discussion.
Thank you. Commissioners, are there questions? Commissioner Meyer.
Thank you. I think this is really great. I think it's beautiful. I think it actually puts into action what the council has been saying its goals are for climate action. So I'm really excited about this. A few comments and then a few questions. So when it comes to both the electric vehicle parking and other things like the bike parking, I definitely I'm receptive and open to what affordability advocates have to say about what the consequences are. I think, especially for like the electric vehicle parking or charging, a key thing to me is just to make sure that they can adapt so that as the demand for electric vehicles increases, that they can increase the charging capacity along with that. So I don't know what, if anything, we would need to require on that end. But that's the key thing that I want to make sure of is that they can scale it up. I love the points-based system. I'm curious to know how exactly you would structure some of the things like, it seems to me that the transit fare subsidy shouldn't be a binary, that it would seem to me that it would make sense to give more points as they give a bigger subsidy. And I think it would make sense to give the biggest number of points when they get from whatever the highest, when they get from the second highest subsidy threshold to free, because I think there's a big difference between charging residents even a nominal amount. I mean, we see this in employer-based incentive programs where, the park board is willing to subsidize your transit pass, like the vast majority of it, but we only had 11 out of 2,000 eligible people actually get it. I think there's a lot of research that shows that they're a lot more likely to get it if it's $0 as opposed to 10 or 20. So if a builder is willing to go all the way and make it completely zero, they're going to get a lot more people asking for that. So I think they should get correspondingly more points if they do. I have some questions about the bike parking specifically. There are a few things that I would like to see happen with it. One, seconding the thoughts from Commissioner Marwa, I think it's important that we have visitor-oriented parking, external to not necessarily the building itself, like it could be inside the building, but has to be accessible by people who might not have access to the full building. I've seen, for example, there was an article not long ago that talked about in New York City, they're putting out these, I don't know what they're called, they're like shipping containers that you can get a code to like open it up and put your bike in there. That would be an example of externally accessible visitor-oriented parking. I would like to see something like that incorporated into the requirements. With the biking requirements, is there any requirement that some proportion of them be put on the ground? Because I've seen in a lot of buildings that the vast majority of the parking is wall-mounted parking, because that is the most space efficient. And that's a problem for someone who can't lift their bike, and especially as we're seeing more e-bikes, which are heavier. I think that's going to be a growing problem. So is that part of the status quo, to have a requirement based on like ground-based parking?
The way the design standard is written right now is that there needs to be enough room for the bike to lock its tire, at least one wheel and the frame to the space. We are certainly open to trying to develop something to the effect that you're talking about, Commissioner Meyer. We have discussed that recently as well, and one of the things we're trying to watch out for is that we want to at least allow some flexibility in how developments meet this standard. And there's been a variety of ways, as you mentioned, the wall mounted thing. So right now we're prioritizing that locking aspect, but we'll take that feedback and think of whether that's not something we can also address, the ground being on the ground.
Yeah, so I think it's important to have at least some proportion of the bike parking spaces be ground-based for people who can't lift them. And I would be willing to accept an overall lower requirement in order to accommodate that, because I know when it's ground-based that it's going to take up more space, but I think it's really important to have a proportion for that. And you tied into my next question. I've seen in a lot of buildings the wall-mounted parking spots. Like for example, at one of the buildings that I work at in North Loop, I never use them because I can only lock my wheel to them, and that makes it really susceptible to theft. So I was happy to see that we've already got the requirement that the frame has to be able to be locked. So yeah, definitely want to keep that. And okay, yeah, I think that was all my questions. Thank you. I think this is really great. You did some great work.
Thanks, Commissioner Meyer. Commissioner Smiley.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Olson, and thank you to staff for putting so much thought into this. I think it's, I also echo Commissioner Meyer's comment that these are really great to see. And I have I guess I have a question that I had written and a few thoughts, but I'm debating on whether or not my question was already answered. So in that sense, maybe I should ask it. I know Commissioner Meyer was asking about ground bicycle parking, and Commissioner Marwa was asking about visitor bicycle parking. I guess my question is more general than that, and kind of goes into the requirement itself, because I didn't necessarily see whether or not the requirement is talking about, is the long-term biking, does that mean covered, like all season, that it will be inside the building, or one of those, like some of those, like as Commissioner Meyer was saying, like containers sort of that has a lock that you can put your bike in. Just kind of wondering, did I miss that?
Commissioner Smiley, we have two separate standards in the zoning ordinance that define how you can, depending upon your use, how you meet these the bike parking requirement. And it's we have a definition for short-term bicycle parking and long-term bicycle parking. Long-term bicycle parking, the important distinction, I think, is what you've already pointed out, is that it's, I'm just trying to read through it here, is that it's enclosed and secured in supervised areas is how it's written. Otherwise, short-term bike parking is usually located out in front of the building or in the public right-of-way, so that patrons to businesses can access them.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So that, I apologize. I did not know the definition of long-term biking from the zoning code. And then my other couple of thoughts are, and kind of going back to the feedback that you had requested from the commission in the memo. One was about like potential other strategies to include is, as I was thinking, whether, because you're referencing shared vehicle, but I'm also wondering whether carpool, for example, for non-residential areas could be something that employers can potentially promote and use a service to connect their employees together. I know, for example, Metro Transit provides a similar service. So something like that is another strategy. Then one of the other comments that I had about what specific uses could potentially have different standards, and I didn't necessarily see them being called out. And some of the ones that I was thinking about were public or government buildings. Like I was thinking, for example, about the Hennepin County Government Center or City Hall, when so many people are coming and going for a variety of different purposes, and something like the Hennepin County Government Center serves not just the city of Minneapolis, but goes way beyond the boundary of the city. So something like that I see as potentially needing different provisions to ensure that visitors are accommodated appropriately. And the other one, kind of thinking about the project that we just saw on Monday, would be potentially hospitals to have different provisions regarding their parking. Then my other thought was, sorry, I'm just like going through the list. My other thought was related to the EV charging. And I know that in the materials that I was reading, you were talking about how a lot of some of the parking spots should be EV ready, and that it seems like it's kind of like a potentially incremental change, hoping to get to more numbers of EV parking. But I was kind of wondering if, at least internally, if the city can develop some kind of a timeline to revisit those thresholds, so that it's not something like we're going to come back, but then it's like 10, 15 years from now. And I say that because I based on what I hear from the automobile industry specifically, also that there might be a lot of change, for example, in the next 5 years, right? So that could potentially change that. So I was just kind of wondering about that timeline. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Smiley. Commissioner Ford.
Thank you. First of all, I'm very, very, very impressed. This is, I think, terrific work, and it will advance the comp plan. And I just was struck by the questions that are being asked and comments that are being made here, the complexity of all this. It never would have occurred to me, but thinking about it more, the bicycle parking requirements, probably thinking about just short-term and long-term is oversimplifying, because you're going to have people who are going to dash in and get something and take about 10 minutes or 5 minutes in a store, have one kind of bicycle parking need, probably a rack. But those who are going to come down to, let's say, to the courthouse, they're probably going to spend several hours down there, whether they like it or not. And that's, in that kind of use, probably a locked locker, like the city used to have lockers downtown. They still do, but bicycle lockers provided by Public Works. But this, I'm just struck by this. It's not simple, and I'm really impressed by the work you've done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Ford. Commissioners, are there any other comments or questions? I'll just add, I agree with Commissioner Meyer. Overall, I really like this. I'm excited to see this coming through. But the, was it 6 points for subsidized transit passes? Also, I'm questioning that a little bit. So I don't know if you want to just like explain that a little bit more next time we see this, or what, but I'm a little skeptical of that many points for that. But other than that, I don't have anything. So we'll move to Commissioner Baxley.
Thank you, Commissioner. Again, I'll echo my other commissioners on the comprehensiveness and the thoughtfulness that has gone into that. So I think what would help me as I evaluate and respond to some of your questions, on the you mentioned focus on physical improvements when you're looking at TDIC. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure, Commissioner Baxley, the preference for physical improvements comes from those two places of one wanting those happen to be the things that research shows have the greatest impact on achieving our goals, but it's an easier thing for the city to enforce. Using the transit fare subsidy is kind of the opposite example. We've been talking with Metro Transit on how they can help us to enforce that standard, and how we're going to be working with Public Works on tracking these in the long run. But you can imagine that figuring out whether or not a building owner is still participating in a Metro Transit program 10 years from now is going to be a little more difficult than knowing that when the building is built, we can inspect it and say, yes, they built it the way they said they would. They provided zero parking, and they put in a real-time transit info station. So that's where the enforcement side of things is influencing or informing what we're proposing.
Got it. That helps. I didn't know if it was some, we accept other sort of green physical improvements outside of the sort of traffic realm, but this is specifically around those things identified. So that's helpful. Thank you. I think related to that then, and I'm assuming this is how you guys began to prioritize those strategies, but maybe talk a little bit about how you came up with the point, how you have them ranked now as we look to evaluate or provide comment on that.
Admittedly, that it's an inexact science here. I think taking the comments from Commissioner Olson and Commissioner Meyer about the transit fare subsidy maybe being worth too much. It's, again, really the list is informed by research showing what has the greatest impact. There are, of course, things outside of this process that really greatly impact whether or not these strategies are going to be effective. We've pointed out in some other presentations, I don't think I hit on it today much, but the fact that Minneapolis just has residential and road infrastructure that makes it possible for some of these, and transit service that makes it possible for some of these things to be effective. So what we're and we've run these by Public Works and our planning staff that have done these reviews in previous years, and have gotten their feedback on what they think is most important. So some of these numbers have changed. We had maintenance agreements and real-time transit info a little higher initially, and we got feedback from Public Works staff saying, well, those don't really make as big of a difference as you might think. So I think that's all to say. I think there's some flexibility here, but really thinking about that connection between this, what the project would do and how they would be impacting those goals of mode split and greenhouse gas reduction. So if, for example, you were to propose to reduce the amount of points that were achieved through the transit fare subsidy, that not only means that you're maybe de-emphasizing that, but you might in effect be putting even more emphasis on zero parking by doing that.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say about that, I'm sorry, I'm kind of droning on here, but the transit fare subsidy, as we have written it, is that there's different standards for residential versus commercial. For residential, we would require that every unit have access to a pass, at least one pass, and that for non-residential, it'd be that 75% of all full-time employees qualify for that transit pass at a reduced rate. We're still working with Metro Transit on this language. I think there's some interest from them to maybe have a distinction between, along the lines of what Commissioner Meyer is bringing up, that having access to the passes sometimes isn't enough. It doesn't mean you're going to get participation in the program. So how do we make sure that people are actually participating in the program? And that's something I hope we have more clarity on for the commission when we bring this back in April.
Great. That's helpful. Yeah, it's not, things are interrelated, and it's hard to start shifting those around without thinking through the full impacts. One more question. Is there, you mentioned peer cities earlier. Are there other cities that have employed similar adjustments and point system ranking that that we're looking at? How, where are we with that, and how do we, for those of us who are interested in maybe doing a little research, who are some other cities that we might look to and see how they're doing compared to this?
Great question. I was hoping that that this was just a brilliant idea that we came up with, and we're leading the charge on this. But it turns out that of course Portland has something like this, right. And San Francisco also has a similar program. And I'm not remembering the details of their programs off the top of my head, but I think something that is relatively unique is how we're taking the traffic study element out of the process for a pretty big chunk of projects.
Okay, great. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Baxley. Back to Commissioner Meyer.
Thank you. So I wanted to clarify, I wasn't meaning to say that I thought the transit passes were too, the points for the transit passes were too generous. I think it should be completely possible to reach the full 6 points that they need through the transit passes. I just thought that it should also be possible for them to meet a lower threshold and mix and match with other things if they're interested in doing that. So if they were interested in getting 1 or 2 or 3 points from elsewhere, then it should be possible for them to do less than the maximum that they would need to earn 6 points and perhaps just earn 3 points. I hope that we can get some tiers into that. But I think it's a really huge deal if we can persuade developers to provide those. And it's something that even if the residents don't use them very often, it's still going to help provide more funding for Metro Transit, for the buses in our system. So I think it'll have positive effects for reducing car dependence for the city as a whole. I just want there to be more flexibility instead of a 0 or 1 thing. So in answering Commissioner Baxley's question, you said, like, what was your default idea on this? Can you just repeat it? Like, what did you originally have in mind to require? Like, what level of subsidy would they have to get the 6 points? You said it was like 75% for commercial, and then were you saying that they had to provide the full price for 1 pass per unit if it's residential?
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. That's helpful, and is in line with some of the comments that we've received from Metro Transit. So as far as the actual like dollar subsidy, that's something I would anticipate we're not going to get into in the zoning ordinance. That's, obviously those numbers will change over time. We're really trying to rely on Metro Transit's existing programs to set this standard. And I think we're very open to amending this strategy as Metro Transit's programs change. But as trying to give an example here, so the residential program that Metro Transit is working on, which it won't be ready when we adopt this ordinance, but they hope to have it ready within the next year or two, is that they could supply Metro passes to residential buildings if the building owner commits to giving at least 1 space or one pass per dwelling unit to every unit in the building, that the cost to the building owner comes in at something like less than $20 a month. So whether or not the building owner passes that cost on to the tenant or they just absorb it as an overall cost in their pro forma, who knows? But they're piloting that program now, and it has been very successful, it sounds like. So.
Okay, and I'm definitely going to trust your judgment and that of the people you've consulted on what is most effective at reaching our goals of reducing car dependency and promoting low carbon and active transportation choices. I guess I would just say that let's come up with the maximum option that they can get the full 6 points for, and also give them a medium option so that they can choose to mix and match rather than having only an all or nothing option. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Meyer. Commissioner Baxley.
Sorry, one more. Is it my understanding that the fare subsidy is only with mass transit? I mean, for example, if a company, because we're really talking about parking reduction, and if a company would sponsor everybody's Uber or Lyft fares so that they wouldn't have to have car ownership, is something like that considered or part of an option there that would feed into that?
Good question. We've had similar feedback around, well, could you qualify for giving nice ride passes to your employees or something like that? And I don't think on the surface we're necessarily opposed to doing things like that. I think I would maybe question whether or not the subsidy to other car-based services would be meeting our goals, but the complication again is with enforcement. I think with transit, we have this partner in Metro Transit that's we can rely on somewhat to get data and do enforcement that way, but harder with services like Uber or Lyft, for example.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it could be a fleet of Teslas, whatever. I mean, they could be sort of responsible vehicles, but sort of tracking that. And if it's to promote less car ownership, that's certainly a step in the right direction too. So just curious. Thank you.
All right. Next up, Commissioner Marwa.
Yeah, hi. I had a kind of a question along the same vein of just trying to understand, Joseph, kind of best practices and research around how do you reduce dependency of like incentivizing families to be one-car households. You're seeing like car dependency is such an issue, and we live in a very cold climate. And if you want to get out of the area, you really need to rely on a car. But I think more achievably, you can be trying to get families to have one car, or one person relies on transit or biking and the other person, maybe in the winter they trade off, whatever it may be. But I guess what's kind of the best practice out there around, is there incentive that developers could, I know they're, only providing one parking spot as is there, a rent credit or something, or this that comes if you're a one car household? I don't know. I'm just kind of curious what kind of practices you're seeing out there to incentivize that route.
The rent credit example is a good one. There are some other cities that have ordinances around requiring the separation of the cost of parking from the cost of rent in residential development. It's been our experience in recent history, at least, that developers are already doing that in Minneapolis. So that's why you're not seeing that here. And it's probably not something that's appropriate for the zoning ordinance anyway. It would be something that would be tackled by our licensing or housing staff. But in large part, all the same things that you would use to get people to get out of their cars completely are the same things that you would do to encourage two-car households to become one-car households. And I think I'd maybe emphasize again that the parking ordinance changes are one part of encouraging that sort of thing to happen. The built form map is a huge aspect of that. Having more development on more of our transit corridors to make it possible to have better transit service is a huge part of it. And then just time. Also, we know from demographics along our first light rail line along the Blue Line, that auto use by households in that corridor has gone down significantly since that line opened. So it's bits and pieces of policy and legislation over time, and I guess that's maybe a cop out to not giving you any specific additional things we might include in this ordinance, but
You're muted, Commissioner Marwa. There you go.
I'm back. All right, guys. Thank you. I just wanted to kind of know what you guys were thinking on that front, kind of approaching it from that angle. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Marwa. Commissioner Meyer.
Thank you. So I like the idea of offering some points, like 1 or 2 for Nice Ride. It should. I don't think it should be as much as for public transit passes, both because it's a lot cheaper, and also because Nice Ride is only available during certain months. But that should be still something that gets them a point or 2 if they provide passes for that. I don't think that we should subsidize Uber or Lyft. There are quite a few studies that have shown that those rideshare programs are significantly increasing congestion. So they reduce the need for parking. So that's the good side of it. And I'm glad they exist. You know, it means that I have a safety mechanism if I need to get somewhere quickly, urgently. But it's still significantly increasing congestion on our roads to have them. So I would think it would go against our goals to subsidize them. And then what was, I'm thinking, what was the other thing we just talked about? I'll come back to it. I forgot what I was going to say on the third thing.
All right. Oops, I'm echoing somewhere. Commissioner Ismaili.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, I'm laughing at your Commissioner Meyer's last comment because that has totally happened to me. It was like literally. Anyway, the one comment that I was thinking about after Commissioner Marwa mentioned the incentives for families to reduce the number of vehicles. And I kind of feel like this may be going a little out of scope of the project and going into the realm of wants and nice to haves, and God, wouldn't it be great if we could somehow impact that is and it will be part of the, like a policy sort of like a program that would be kind of after the fact of a development. So it would be, it would have to be tracked somehow. But then I was thinking, if, for example, an employer, a larger employer, is able to or provides remote working opportunities to their employees, so that that reduces their need to drive and be physically present in that in the building and whatnot, and that might be a good incentive also. And I think many people could win from that, including the employees themselves. And because I was like thinking, well, how can a family only have one car if there are more than two people who are working in different places? And if I don't have to travel for work, then I can potentially pull that off. So just kind of wondering if that's something that's doable or can be explored. Again, I understand it goes kind of into the programming side of things as opposed to physical infrastructure at the time of permitting. But we're putting all the wants on the table.
All right. Commissioner Ford, go ahead.
Thank you again. One quick question. The discussion about Nice Ride, have you given any thought to providing some credits or points, excuse me, for having accommodations for a Nice Ride station on the property?
We have received that as an idea to consider from some staff. At this point, we haven't put it in the table, but if this is something the commission feels strongly about, we can explore it more. The only caution I would give to that is that, I think Commissioner Meyer had mentioned, that they're not year round. They also sometimes are not installed in the same place every year, so there's some ongoing enforcement that would be needed. And then, of course, in the event that they stop participating in that at some point in the future, we would have to go after those properties to get them to do something else from the table in the future. So those have been the concerns that have kept that off of our recommendation so far.
But with regard to the last concern, that's also true of whether they're offering a transit pass. They might stop offering it sometime in the future and you've got the same problem.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ford. Commissioner Meyer.
Yeah, sorry. I remember what I was going to say, which is just that I like what Commissioner Marwood brought up, and just wanted to mention that California has a statewide law that requires the builder to unbundle the cost of parking from the cost of rent. So I would look to that law as an example that would be good for us to follow. And you may be right that it shouldn't be in the zoning, that it should be in licensing, but it still would help address some of the goals that we want to see. So even if we're not directly requiring it through us, it's still something that should be mentioned in the conversation about this, that we should want those costs unbundled. And I know that I can think of quite a few examples of properties nearby that don't do that. So it may be the case that most of the ones that are in recent years have switched over to that, but certainly it wasn't like that very far back in the past. But I still think it would be a good thing to do. And then about the nice ride station idea that Commissioner Ford brought up, I think that's something that could fit within kind of the miscellaneous category that you included, that that the builder could make a proposal, and if it's a place that doesn't have a nice ride station nearby, that we need one, we can take those on a case by case basis. But I wouldn't have a separate dedicated category to that, because like you said, I think sometimes there's already going to be a station nearby, and so they won't really need it. All right, thanks.
All right, Commissioner Caprini.
Hi, everyone. So I am learning so much and I love it. And I think I'm also so old school that I'm also really kind of taken back, because, I'm probably older than most people on this call. And just the direction that we're going, I totally in agreement with, climate control and, eliminating green gas emissions, all of that. But my question and concern is, I'm going to use North Minneapolis as an example. So earlier in the conversation, Mr. Bernard Joseph, you mentioned grocery stores, and I know that you'd referenced loading, but there was, but you mentioned something about grocery stores going outside of the city in the surrounding areas. Perhaps you said suburbs. So I'm thinking about all of this in terms of like what it looks like 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And we're all, I would hope, pretty aware of how slow going progress is for North Minneapolis, and the disparities, economically, housing, all of the things that we're hopefully beginning to lift now, since there's been a lot of progressive changes that have happened. And what do you mean by, so for instance, Cub Food? So am I to believe that with all of these kinds of changes and eliminating, places where people can drive, like parking and all that, that the hope is that eventually the city will become a space where there are no big grocery stores with big parking lots, and there'll be more like the Whole Foods that's downtown inside a building or an apartment complex. And then the other thing is, how are we educating and getting information to, I'm going to use North Minneapolis as an example, even though, you could speak to Cedar Riverside or, various pockets throughout the city. How are we educating people on the goals of these zoning changes, and who's responsible for getting them that information? Because from where I am and where I'm sitting, what I feel like what I'm going to hear, people are going to start to notice changes. This is always how it is. And then they're going to start asking, when did this happen? Who knew? Where could we have gotten information? Not necessarily to push back, but to feel like they're a part of, and that they are they're obviously benefiting because we're saving the earth. So I think I guess I want to know who's responsible for that, and I'd like to know, because I want to make sure that it happens, because a lot of the and not necessarily, everything that you've presented tonight, but just the importance of what you're presenting and why, because I was thinking about the hospitals downtown, and like that was brought up, and the city hall and the government center, all of these places where people are coming from all over the state, pretty much. We can't say that they're not, and being required to park 5 miles away, and maybe that's the case, and take the blue line or the red line or the yellow line further into the city to get to those spaces. So the bottom line is, these are the things that I want you to answer. Is what you said about the grocery stores, is there a notion or a belief or a desire to get rid of the bigger grocery stores, to push them out of the city? Is that because it could be a part of all of this, and who's providing information and education on the why these zoning rules or laws or whatever statutes, whatever they're called, are being changed? So I'll stop there.
Sure. Commissioner Caprini, thank you for those questions. In terms of the grocery stores, the intent with, and maybe I should give a little more detail on what I was talking about in terms of grocery stores, is that we have loading requirements today for uses that get a lot of deliveries. Grocery stores is one of those uses that have trucks coming and going fairly frequently. In Minneapolis 2040, we identified some uses that would be really important to getting people out of their cars and to creating more complete communities throughout the city. So there's neighborhoods that really don't have access to groceries, where you have no choice but to get in your car to go get groceries, or to get on a relatively long transit ride. So the goal with reducing some of those loading requirements for grocery stores is that it might make it, or we hope that it would make it easier for grocery stores to locate within neighborhoods on commercial corridors that might have the right space to physically put a store, but might not have enough room to get their loading that we require in the zoning ordinance to happen on that site. And I think we're thinking in terms of smaller neighborhood-sized grocery stores when we're talking about this requirement.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second, because that's exactly what I was thinking that you were saying, and I'm glad that we came to that space, because in North Minneapolis, those locations are convenience stores that don't necessarily have the kinds of products that are healthy and conducive to a long grocery list that would last someone a month. So I guess I'm really working hard to try to push myself away from, because I agree with what we're discussing, and I want to go in that direction. My concern is the unintentional consequences of the lack of information and education, and then the opportunities that should be present for neighborhoods where these smaller grocery stores will be located, because that's not the case in the area in which I live. So I say that so that it's on the record, and that it's something that I will continue to have conversations about. So I will let you continue. I just wanted to interject that in, because I figured that's what you were going to say. And I don't, my hope is that, let's say a location like Emerson and Lowry will actually have the kinds of groceries that I would, or someone else would want to purchase outside of a bag of chips and a pickle.
Yep, and our hope is that what we're doing here is to reduce one barrier to that happening. In terms of what you mentioned, as far as making sure community members, business owners, everyone's aware of these goals. Absolutely on the same page with you there. The thing that we would point to is that there's unending appetite for that type of outreach, and it's absolutely necessary, and we have limited resources, and it's not a great message to give. But with Minneapolis 2040, which is what all of this is based on, that's where all of the goals come from. We had over 200 or over 150 public meetings, received thousands upon thousands of points of feedback, and that's what we're largely pointing to in terms of how we got the word out about those goals. In terms of this specific project, we're doing most of our outreach digitally, obviously, and that involves getting in contact with our business associations and small business owners throughout the city, and our neighborhood groups, notifying them as well. So all the information that we've...
If I might make a suggestion, and
Please.
I mean this with all due respect, I realize we're in a pandemic and it's difficult for folks to be up against one another. But as we are moving in this new normal and we are starting to get back to a space where we are gathering in places, I've seen people tabling at places like Cub Food on Broadway. I've seen people handing out information in front of the library on Lowry Avenue. So I guess what I'm suggesting as we go forward and we get a little closer to a space where we are able to actually do those kinds of things more frequently, I would suggest that perhaps the city consider tabling at Cub Food on Broadway to provide people with information. Find spaces in areas where we don't normally go to, because I guarantee you that the thousands of people that have responded to the surveys you spoke to, I could probably knock on almost every door in certain pockets of North Minneapolis and ask them if they know anything about it, and they would probably tell me no. And whether or not they would care or not isn't the case. It's a matter of just getting the information and knowing. That's all I care about, whether that they get the information. They don't have to agree with it or disagree with it. And I'm not putting this solely on you, Joseph. I think everything that you've presented tonight is amazing, and I want to save Mother Earth, trust me. I just get very concerned about the unintentional consequences of people who don't have the education about what we are doing to them. And I want them to feel as if they are doing something with us. Does that make sense? And that's how I feel about everything that I am a part of. So I'll stop preaching and let you continue. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Caprini. Commissioners, are there any other comments or questions? I'm not seeing any, but this is your last chance. Commissioner Marwa.
I just thank you, Commissioner Caprini, for bringing up about kind of the lack of education about why we reduce parking and just in general. I went to, urban planning school, so all we talked about was reducing parking and why that was important. But many of my friends didn't, my partner didn't, and they constantly get the pushback of like, well, why? Like, we live in a city that everyone drives in. That's kind of how Minneapolis is. I feel like that public education campaign around why are we the environmental impacts, especially somewhere like in Minnesota, which is so different than Portland and so different than Denver and other issues, kind of is that general kind of feeling like we're going in one direction, but people aren't necessarily coming with it. And I know it's part of the 2040 plan and all the work that was done into that, but as these kind of ideas and kind of impacts of, seeing Uptown not have any new parking, seeing the North Loop not getting all these places where people go, and then now there's no parking being built, just, keep that in mind, that it still is this very unknown and kind of reasonable idea to many people who didn't study this day in and day out and understand why it's so important to protect it. But thank you, Commissioner Caprini, for bringing that up.
Thank you, Commissioner Marwa. I'm not seeing any more questions or comments. Joe, have we answered all of your questions? Have you gotten what you need?
Yes, thank you. Great discussion and feedback this evening. Of course, if you have others, you know where to find us.
Thank you. All right. I know Kimberly's gone. I'm not sure if any other staff have any updates or if any commissioners have any comments before we adjourn. All right. With that, Commissioner Caprini, did you? I don't think so. Okay. Okay. We've completed all of our agenda items. And our next meeting will be Committee of the Whole on March 25th. Thank you, everybody.